So as we begin our time this morning, I'm going to start off with perhaps a more difficult question for you to consider. And I want you to think about a time or a season of brokenness that you have had in your life. And that can be for a number of reasons. Perhaps it comes from a moral failing where you became broken over your sin, or even just the consequences of the sin. Sometimes it comes from the death of a loved one, expected or unexpected. When we lose someone important to us, it can lead to a season of brokenness. For some people, perhaps it's the loss of a job. For so many people, they kind of tie their identity into their job. And so not only do they lose kind of their ability to provide for themselves and their family, but they feel like they've lost a part of themselves. Maybe the loss of a pregnancy. I think with miscarriages, that's something that we don't talk about a lot. But for many couples, they experience a great season of brokenness over that. Perhaps it's the facing of an injury or an illness that set you back, or maybe was even life-threatening and led to a season of brokenness. Maybe a divorce, and sometimes the grief and the pain that can happen from a failed marriage. Perhaps it's the experiencing of an injustice where we feel like we were oppressed or abused or taken advantage of. Or for many of us, it's the witnessing of an injustice in somebody else's life. For people that are close to us and we see something that happens to them that leads to a brokenness in ourselves. For some people, it's even just a brokenness over the injustice that we see throughout the world. See, the situation may be different for each person here, but I can speak confidently in saying that all of us experience seasons of great brokenness. Now, in some cases, that brokenness really never goes away. We stay in those seasons. There's a permanent damage that's done, and we deal with that. And for others of us, of course, sometimes those seasons do pass. We lost a job, but we got a new one. We were sick or we were injured, but God healed us. But even in those situations, does that really take back the damage that was done? How can that go back and replace and restore the years and the moments that we have lost in those seasons of brokenness? And when we come to those types of seasons of deep hurting and of deep brokenness, it can become very common to question, where is God in this? Where is God's hand? Where is God's sovereignty? And it's also very common to experience a wondering of, what do I do in this particular situation? How do I handle this, and how do I approach that? Because those questions are so common, that is why we're beginning this 4-week journey through the book of Joel. As Steve mentioned a little bit earlier, Joel is a minor prophet because it is short, not because the message is unimportant. In fact, this small little book of the Old Testament does enormous things in connecting our Old Testament to our New Testament and helping us complete and understand that story. And it has a powerful message for those of us who are dealing with brokenness and hurt in our lives. See, the situation is that, as for Israel, is coming at a point where they are experiencing a season of great brokenness. That some natural disasters have come in and have left the whole nation of Israel just reeling in pain. First, there is a locust plague that comes through and eats their food. There's a drought that follows that. And so the people are really lost. They can't eat. They can't drink. They can't take care of their animals. Worship is kind of messed up because they can't make the sacrifices in the temple. And they are wondering as a nation, are we even going to make it? What are we going to do? But in that moment, God sends a message to a man named Joel, who calls for them to have a truly godly response to their season of brokenness. One that includes lament, one that includes repentance, and one that includes crying out to the Lord. Now, we are going to see by the end of Joel, God is going to do some amazing things. He is going to hear the people, and he's going to do some awesome works. But I don't want us to rush there, okay? Because I think sometimes what happens is when we rush through that, we accidentally communicate. Because we want to get to the hope, we want to get to the joy. What we kind of accidentally communicate is that if I'm going through a season of grief, or I'm going through a season of lament, or I'm feeling as though I'm in a place of brokenness, we feel like, well, there's something wrong with me. That I must not know how to worship the Lord because of the way that I feel. But instead, lamenting and crying out to God, as we see, is a very godly response. So listen, this is going to be a 4-week series, so I'm just going to warn you in advance. We're going to deal with some difficult topics up front. Okay, now we're going to get to the hope. We're going to get to the joy. God is going to do some amazing things, and that is true in our life too. God is going to do some amazing things, and when we turn to Him, He is the great restorer. He is the master of taking our broken pieces and turning them into something truly beautiful. Doesn't mean all the pain is going to go away. Doesn't mean it's going to turn out the way that you want, but I am telling you that God is the great restorer and can do far more than we would ever ask, dream, or imagine. But first, let us sit and learn how to properly deal with the pain that we experience in our life. That is the focus of today's passage of Joel chapter 1, that in brokenness we can lament and cry out to God, because that is a part of a biblical response to our pain and to our suffering. And so we're going to see at the start of Joel, he's going to kind of call the people's attention to this national disaster that they're facing. From there, he's going to start going into the biblical response. He's going to start with lament, and then he's going to start giving them instructions on how to cry out to the Lord. So let's go ahead and open up to Joel chapter 1, starting at verse 1. It says, "The word of the Lord that came to Joel, the son of Pethuel." Now, that's a very common opening for most prophets. They begin kind of usually with the guy's name and that he's received this word from the Lord. Sometimes that's very helpful because we can get a lot about the background from for the book to help us understand it. I'll tell you right now that unfortunately with this verse, that doesn't really help us very much. Anything we know about Joel has to come from this book. Outside of that, we don't really know who he is. And because of that, this book is also notoriously difficult to know the background for. We don't know when to date it. That there's some different interpretive reasons, like different scholars believe different things, and we could discuss that. If you want to go into that, that's fine. But I think because of all of that, the best way to approach Joel is just to take the background that it gives to us, which is the plagues of locusts, which is the plagues of the drought, and how God does this restorative work. Like that's what we know, and so that's what we're going to work with as we begin through this. Now, nonetheless, with verse 1, although it may not give us kind of the background that maybe we would have liked, nonetheless, I don't want us to skip past a very important statement that is made in Joel chapter 1, verse 1, and that is that God speaks. In Israel's pain, in Israel's hurting, a season of absolute brokenness, God speaks. And I want to tell you very clearly this morning that God still speaks. And if you are in a season of brokenness and you are in a season of hurting, God is speaking to you. The word of the Lord speaks. The prophet Joel, his message still speaks to us. If we will open up our hearts and we will open up our ears to receive it, God still speaks. He then moves into his message. Verse 2, he says, "Hear this, you elders. Give ear, all inhabitants of the land. Has such a thing happened in your days or in the days of your fathers? Oh, tell your children of it, and let your children tell their children and their children to another generation." So the first thing Joel does is he gathers the people around, old and young. He says, gather around and let's talk about this brokenness that we are experiencing. He says, has anything happened in your days or the days of your father? That's why the elders are gathered. He says, let's find the oldest people that we can find. Ask if they've ever seen anything like this. Like this is such a unique thing that they are experiencing, a unique season of pain that they are experiencing. And Joel says because of that, we should tell our children of it. And tell your children and their children and so on. Now, I think that's huge because let's keep in mind, God hasn't answered their prayers yet. Right? Like there is no hope yet. God has not done the healing. God has not done the restoring. Joel does not know that that is going to happen yet. Even in that season of pain, even in that season of brokenness, he says, let's gather around and let's talk about it. I think he does that for a number of reasons. One is because he knows who God is and he knows what's happening. He understands the importance of talking about pain, and he understands the importance of crying out to God, knowing he's the one who brings solutions. But I also think a part of the reason he gathers them is because suffering is not meant to be done in silence. It is not meant to be done in isolation. But when we gather together as a community, there is a strength in that, and there is a healing in that. And so what is this unique disaster that has struck the people? Well, we find out when we turn to verse 4. He says, what the cutting locust has left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust has left, the hopping locust has eaten. And what the hopping locust has left, the destroying locust has eaten. And so what he's describing here is these swarms of locusts that have come in and kind of destroyed everything that they have. Now, there's again, he uses different terms for locusts, right? And depending on your translation, it probably has different words for what those locusts are, because if we're just being honest, we don't really know what that means. It could be different breeds of locusts, could be different stages. People have different theories. The point actually isn't that. The point is the incredible devastation that has happened. It's really kind of probably all from the same thing. I kind of think of it as kind of like my refrigerator, right? Like I buy food, but then I've got kids, and I might say, well, what the cutting kids have left, well, the swarming kids have eaten it. What the swarming kids have left, the hopping kids have eaten. And whatever the hopping kids have left, the destroying kids have eaten. What I really mean is I only have 2 kids. My point is the absolute devastation that has happened in my refrigerator. Now, far greater, though, than the devastation that might happen in my refrigerator is what the locusts have done. A locust plague may not sound severe to us, but then it was actually a very big deal. If you don't know what a locust is, let me go ahead and see if I can put one up on the screen for you. As you can see, it looks very much like a grasshopper, and they are very similar. Let me go ahead and read a little bit, though, to you. This is from National Geographic about what the locust can do. It says the locust, a plague of locusts, is a devastating natural disaster. These infestations have been feared and revered throughout history, and they can still wreak havoc today. Now, locusts are related to grasshoppers, and the two look similar. However, locust behavior can be something entirely different. The locust has another behavioral phase called the gregarious phase. When environmental conditions are right, the locust can congregate into thick, mobile, ravenous swarms. The locust swarms devastate crops, and they cause major agricultural damage and attend human misery, famine, and starvation. The desert locust, which is what they would have had in Israel, is particularly notorious. And still today, they can threaten as much as 1/10 of the world's population. This is crazy. A desert locust swarm can be 460 square miles in size and pack 40 to 80 million locusts in less than a half of a square mile. Now, each locust can eat its weight in plants every day, so a swarm of that size can eat as much as 423 million pounds of plants every single day. Now, also, like the individual locusts within them, the swarms typically are in motion, and they cover vast distances. In 1954, a swarm flew from northwest Africa all the way to Great Britain. So you think about that. I mean, you can picture a cloud, right? 460 square mile cloud of millions of insects packed into that. And listen, National Geographic, they're just recording what they've seen, right? What they've seen in modern times and observed from locust behavior. If God is indeed behind the locust, as Joel will clearly state that he is, then there is no telling the type of damage that can result from this. And so we might not think that it's a big deal, but what has happened is it seems swarm after swarm of locusts has come. Just when they think it's over, something new happens. He says, oh, the cutting locust left, but then the swarming locust eats whatever's left over. Well, now we have no food, but somehow the swarming locust leave and the hopping locust eats. Now there's absolutely nothing but stubble. There's no actual food for us, and yet the destroying locusts come in. And let me tell you, I think that is so often how people experience brokenness and suffering in their life. That we experience some sort of hardship, and we say, well, at least I can make it through that somehow, and then something else seems to happen. And then we think we're going to be able to carry on and deal with that, and then something else seems to happen, leading to this overwhelming state of feeling broken. But I think one simple application we can walk away with from these first 4 verses to understand this. It's okay to be broken. It's okay to be broken. It's okay to be in pain. It's okay to be ruined. It is okay to hurt. And it's okay to share that pain with others. But I believe that no one should ever have to go through their brokenness alone. See, that's what I'm not okay with. That's what I think the church should not be okay with. That people would feel in isolation in their brokenness. They somehow have to hide it and disguise it and pretend that everything is okay so that we cannot go through brokenness as a community. That's what I'm not okay with. Because God has called us to be in community. Now the truth is, that means we have to be honest about our pain. And I know that's scary. I know it is. But there is such a great healing in that. And I've said this before, but I'll gladly say it again. That sometimes I think we believe that we need to be fake kind of with our happiness and our joy and present that because people know that we're a Christian and we want to represent God well, so we want to pretend that we're strong, and so we kind of cover ourselves with platitudes so we don't have to really deal with pain. Listen, the world does not need fake Christians. It's had plenty of those. What the world needs is real Christians suffering well, dealing with their pain openly and honestly, and inviting God into the process. That's what the world needs. And I've said this before too, but when we actually hide our pain from people, what we do is we rob the church. You rob the church of the chance to love you. You rob the church of the chance to pray over you. You rob the church of the chance to bear the burden with you. Do not rob the church. That is what's not okay. It is okay to be broken. It's not okay that we would try to go through that brokenness alone. After calling attention to this national disaster, for the people to assemble and talk about it, Joel then calls for them to have a proper response to their brokenness, and that begins with lament. Picking up at verse 5, he says, "Awake, you drunkards, and weep. And wail, all you drinkers of wine, because of the sweet wine. For it is cut off from your mouth. For a nation has come up against my land, powerful and beyond number. Its teeth are a lion's teeth. It has the fangs of a lioness. It has laid waste my vine and splintered my fig tree. It has stripped off their bark and thrown it down, and their branches are made white." When he moves into this call to begin lamenting, he starts with the drunkards, which sounds kind of funny to us. Why would he begin there? But the drunkenness means a number of things. Because one, that can only happen in a time of excess, right? you have to have more than enough to be able to get drunk. Well, that can't happen anymore. So even if, because there is no excess, there's not even the beginning amount. So even if someone wanted to spend their absolute last penny on some sort of form of alcohol, they wouldn't have that option. And so they weep. What's being stated here is that absolutely everybody is affected by this disaster. Rich, poor, disciplined, undisciplined, everyone feels the weight of this plague upon them. Wine is also often a symbol of joy. What he's saying is joy is cut off from the people. And so he says, you know what you need to do? You need to wake up. He says you need to wail. You need to cry out and lament and grieve about what is happening before you. He goes on and he says in verse 8, lament like a virgin wearing sackcloth for the bridegroom of her youth. The grain offering and the drink offering are cut off from the house of the Lord. The priests mourn, the ministers of the Lord. The fields are destroyed, the ground mourns because the grain is destroyed, and the wine dries up, and the oil languishes. He paints this picture of a newly betrothed couple that has the husband pass away before they can actually finish the marriage process. So in their culture, what would happen is you would become engaged, betrothed to one another, and by all, in every way really, you were considered married at that point. The only thing that hasn't happened is the final marriage feast and the consummation of the wedding. And so it's a time of looking forward to this great season of joy that's before you. If you're kind of familiar with biblical stories, you can kind of think of what happened to Mary and Joseph. That was the stage that they were in. They were betrothed to one another, so they were considered married. But they hadn't consummated the wedding yet. And so when it turns out Mary is pregnant, it says Joseph was planning on divorcing her quietly. That's how that situation kind of comes out. But when this is supposed to be a season of great joy and expectation and happiness, but then the husband dies. And so gone are the promises of a family. Gone are the promises of security. Gone are the promises of a new life and joy together. Can you imagine the type of lamenting that would come with that? The type of crying out and the grieving that young woman would experience. Joel says, you need to lament like that. You need to openly grieve like that. Why should they grieve like that? He says, because the temple sacrifices can no longer be made. Now, this wouldn't be true as New Testament Christians, but under the Old Covenant and in the Old Testament, one of the ways that they needed to relate to God was through proper sacrifices in the temple. Grain sacrifices and wine sacrifices. They can't do that. And so it says the priests mourn. There'd be a lot of mourning for the priests in that circumstance because, one, they're not going to be able to eat. The way they were provided for is through those temple sacrifices. The portion was set aside for them. So they can no longer provide for themselves. They can no longer provide for their family. And so they mourn. They can no longer work. And so they mourn. But even greater than that, they can no longer help the people relate to God properly. To cry out to Him, to come and to intercede for them. They can't do it. And so they mourn and they lament. Next, he says that even the farmer should join in on this process of mourning. He says, be ashamed, O tillers of the soil. Wail, O vine dressers, for the wheat and the barley, because the harvest of the field has perished. The vine dries up and the fig tree languishes, pomegranate, palm, and apple. All of the trees of the field are dried up. And so gladness dries up from the children of men. So joining in this call to lament is he also adds that the farmers and the tillers of the field should lament along with them because once again, they have a duty and obligation, right, to provide for themselves and provide for their family, but also as the farmers, they have a great obligation and duty to provide for all of the people, and they can't do it. Because the locust plague has come, and they have no solution. They can't provide for themselves, they can't provide for their family, they can't offer a solution that's going to provide for the nation, and so they feel ashamed, and so they lament. It says that actually gladness is dried up from the children of men. He says this is the time to lament. This is not a time to put on a fake smile, to walk into church and to say, oh, I'm just too blessed to be stressed. I'm just blessed and highly favored. No, you're not. This is a time to lament. This is a time to grieve. I think one simple application we can make from these verses is to understand that in our brokenness, we need to lament. That is a part of a biblical response to pain and to suffering that we see again and again. Now, if you look at the dictionary, it's going to define lament as simply an expression of deep sorrow. That's all it really means to lament. And I think we need to do that. We need to express the deep sorrow that we have. However, the Bible would add more to that. There's a little bit more to the biblical lament. And so here's a few things that we might include with a biblical lament. One is a biblical lament invites God into the process. It is not lamenting on your own. It's not crying out on your own. It's not experiencing pain on your own. It is inviting God into the picture, recognizing that He is still there and recognizing that sometimes it's difficult to understand what He's doing, but nonetheless inviting Him into the process of our grief and pain that we are experiencing. It calls for us to pour out all of our emotions before him. If you read the Psalms of Lament or the book of Lamentations, they hold nothing back from how they feel. They cry out to God, hiding nothing. Their anger, their pain, their anguish, their sadness, all of it is expressed before the Lord. A part of a biblical lament is understanding our emotions and pouring those out before God. But at the same time, it invites God into the picture even when they don't understand what God is doing. That a biblical lament, see, so often I think that what the enemy tells us then, and the way he deceives us, is now we want to blame God. You got to get angry with God. You don't want to invite him into that picture. And we cut ourselves off in our time of grief from the greatest source of strength and comfort we can experience. And instead, a biblical lament asks God for his strength, for his wisdom, for his comfort, for his power, even when we don't fully understand what he is doing. The fourth thing about biblical lament we need to understand is that it is also an act of worship. That for many of us, when we think of worship, we only think of happy things. Make a joyful noise to the Lord. Clap your hands and play a cymbal and a tambourine. Listen, that is worship. There can be joy in worship. That is an expression of worship. But lamenting and grieving and dealing with your pain before God and inviting him into that picture is still a form of biblical worship because it invites God in that process. Now, the last thing I want us to understand about a biblical lament is that it's also a process. See, the truth is about when it comes to lamenting and it comes to grief, it's very complicated because everyone experiences it a little bit differently. But I think sometimes we just try to rush the process. Sometimes we just want to rush through that and get to the hope and to the joy. But a biblical understanding of grief and lament is that it does take time. But just because it takes time, and I want to be clear on this, that a lament does not mean we're just wallowing in our pain. It doesn't mean we're just sitting there helplessly. What it means is that it's directional. It moves us closer towards God, even through our pain. It is drawing closer to the Lord. And so sometimes when it comes to grief, that can take a long time. Sometimes we never feel like we're fully over it. And for many people, what they'll experience is they'll go through a season of grief and lament, and they kind of feel like they've experienced some sort of healing and processed that, only to find themselves in the same season later on in life. And what I want you to know is that's fine. That's normal. That's okay. But make it a biblical lament, make it directional, and learn how to lean into God through all of that pain. Because again, I think the enemy is going to tell us we need to cut God out of the picture. And we rob ourselves of the true source of strength and power and comfort that we can have. Biblical lament is directional and leads to action. And that's where Joel takes us next, is into this place of action. He calls for them to cry out to the Lord. Verse 13, he says, "Put on sackcloth and lament, O priests. Wail, O ministers of the altar. Go in and pass the night in sackcloth, O ministers of my God, because the grain offering, the drink offering are withheld from the house of your God. So consecrate a fast. Call a solemn assembly. Gather the elders and the inhabitants of the land to the house of the Lord your God, and cry out to the Lord." That along with lament, he says, publicly gather together, gather everyone that you can, and cry out to God. That a part of a biblical response is lamenting and crying out to God and inviting him back into the picture. Verse 15, he says, "Alas for the day of the Lord is near. As destruction from the Almighty it comes. Is not the food cut off from before our eyes? Joy and gladness from the house of our God?" So Joel is envisioning what's called the day of the Lord. Now we need to explain that a little bit. That's a major portion of what Joel talks about. So when you read that biblical term, day of the Lord, or sometimes the day of the Almighty, or whatever title of God is given in that place, what it's referring to is an ultimate day of kind of the end of all time, right? It's called a great and terrible day. It is both of those things. It is a day of salvation. It is a day of judgment. It is a day of reckoning when God finally deals with people. That's the ultimate day of the Lord. But what the Bible says, and the way it's spoken about in the Old Testament, is that there are also kind of precursors that lead up to that day of the Lord, and sometimes they're referred to as also a day of the Lord. You can kind of think of them as like little mini days of the Lord that are supposed to remind us and point us forward to the ultimate day of judgment that would come, the ultimate day when God comes and has this day of reckoning with absolutely everything. And so what Joel is doing is he's recognizing that this particular day that they're experiencing with the locust plague and their brokenness is one of those many days of the Lord. Now he knows that from other places in Scripture, like Deuteronomy chapter 28, that under the Old Covenant, this is not true for us, but under the Old Covenant, there were specific blessings that would happen when they followed the Lord, specific curses that would happen when they didn't. A locust plague was very clearly stated as one of the things that would happen when they didn't. And so he's recognizing that this is a calling for them to repent and to recognize that ultimately the final day is going to come and they need to get right with God before that happens. Now, we need to understand that not every bit of our pain and brokenness that we experience in our lives is a direct result from our individual sin. And some people believe that way, and so the car doesn't start that morning, and they're saying, what did I did wrong? Or they experience a season of loss or experience of devastation. They say, well, I must have done something wrong. That is not always the case, nor is every disaster that we face an actual day of the Lord, right? So those are sometimes, suffering can be complicated, it can be for multiple reasons. We don't even always know why it happened. But here's something that we definitely can say. Every bit of brokenness that we experience in our life, every bit of pain we experience in our life, is in the end ultimately a result of living in a sinful world. Ultimately, it's because the world is broken because of sin. And I think one of the healthiest things we can do, and we'll talk a little bit more about this next week, one of the healthiest things we can do is recognize we have contributed to the world's brokenness. We've contributed to with our sin and brokenness in our lives and other people's lives. But rather than us getting angry at God and being angry at God for that, when we see brokenness, it should cause us to lean into Him. And to say, this is the problem with the world, that there is still sin in it. And we need God to come and to set things right. And so when we experience it, we long. We experience suffering, we should long for the day of the Lord. We should pray and say, come quickly, O Lord. Come and set things right. Do away with our pain. Do away with sin. Do away with brokenness so we can stand before you as God with us as your people. Joel goes on in verse 17. He says, the seed shrivels under the clods. The storehouses are desolate. The granaries are torn down because the grain is dried up. Oh, how the beasts groan. The herds of cattle are perplexed because there's no pasture for them. Even the flocks of the sheep suffer. But to you, O Lord, I call. For fire has devoured the pastures of the wilderness. Flame has burned all the trees of the field. Even the beasts of the field pant for you. Because the water brooks are now dried up, and fire has devoured the pastures of the wilderness. So as Joel kind of moves forward, then he unveils that there's another problem that Israel is facing, as if the locust wasn't enough. But apparently a drought has also come as well. The brooks are dried up, and all the seed is drying out. And again, that is so often how we experience pain and suffering in our own lives. Then when we experience a pain and suffering, then all of a sudden it seems something else comes on, and it leaves us completely overwhelmed. Joel is looking at the land, he's saying the animals are crying out because they're hungry, because they're thirsty, and so they long for God to set things right. Joel looks back at the land, he says, it looks like a fire has devoured it. It looks like a land has been raised by war. And so what does he do? He says, to you, O Lord, I call. Because that is a response to brokenness. That in our brokenness, we need to cry out to God. That is a biblical response. Not to run away and try to isolate ourselves, but to cry out to God and say, even when I don't know what you're doing, to you, O Lord, I call. To you, O Lord, I cry. That a biblical response to pain and suffering is we lament and we cry out to the Lord. Now, as I said at the start of the sermon, this is going to be a 4-week series, and we will, by the end, see how God will answer His people. God is going to do a work that goes beyond what they would have ever have asked for, what they ever would have thought of, or ever would have dreamed possible. But I don't want us to rush there, because I think we still need to learn to lament. And I don't want to end this particular sermon and this particular time together without giving us a proper place in order to do so. Like, I don't know what happens when you come to church. I know for many of us what we expect is just to have a joyful time together, and often we do. But I think when that's all we experience and that's all that we do, sometimes we leave out large portions of Scripture that teaches us how to lament and grieve. And understanding that is a part of living in God's world. That is a part of learning how to worship. And so here's what we're going to do as we close our time together. Is we're going to give ourselves a space and an opportunity to lament. And so I'm going to ask the worship team to actually come back up and join me back on the stage. And what we're going to do is first we're going to say a corporate prayer together. And so there is a reader's part, a leader's part, which is going to be the exact words of Psalm 13. I lifted them right out of the page. And so I will read that part, but then there are words that you will respond with the congregation together, making a corporate prayer in a corporate time of lament. And so we are going to begin to pray together and lament and cry out to God together. And then what's going to happen is, and I'm going to invite you to take your seat again, and the band is going to play another song. During this song, you're going to have 2 choices before you. One of those choices and one of those options is you can sit and you can lament on your own. And you can grieve on your own, and you can cry out to God in desperation. However, I would encourage you, because as we have said, lamenting and crying out to God is not meant to be done in isolation. And so we will have people at the back of the sanctuary who are prepared for this, who are ready to pray over you for whatever is going on in your life. They are not going to judge you or be angry with you. Their desire is to love you well and to cover you with prayer. So anytime during that next song will be played, if you have something you would like prayer over, then I want to invite you to go and to receive that prayer. I think that's so important. Because the truth is, I know many of us here have things we need to lament over. I know we do. I know we need to learn to cry out to God. And so let's learn to do this together. For some of us, it's things that are long past, things long ago, but we've never really allowed ourselves to lament. We've never allowed ourselves to grieve. We've certainly never asked God to come into that picture, and now is our time to do so. For others of us, it's a fresh season that we are experiencing now, a fresh moment of pain that we are experiencing now, and we need to lament over that, cry out to God, and invite Him into the picture. For all of us, we can look at the brokenness of the world, the brokenness of our nation, and the brokenness of our community here in Pueblo, and we can lament over that. And we can cry out to God and say, God, we want to see you move. So if you're willing to, I want to invite you to stand and let us say this corporate prayer of lament together. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul, have sorrow in my heart all of the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord, my God. Light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death, lest my enemy say, I have prevailed over him, lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken. But I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. And I will sing to the Lord, because he has dealt bountifully with me. Please be seated. I invite you to take a moment to lament and grieve, and if you would like prayer for anything, prayer is available for you in the back. Let's continue to worship together.